There is a hill in southeastern Turkey where the wind carries the dust of 12,000 years. It rises from the plains near the ancient city of Konli, unremarkable to the untrained eye, covered in sparse grass and scattered limestone. For millennia, farmers walked past it without a second glance. Shepherds grazed their flocks on its slopes, never suspecting what lay beneath their feet. The hill had a name in the local tongue, Göbekli Tepe, which translates to something like the hill with a belly or the pot-bellied hill. It was a gentle description for a place that would eventually reshape everything we thought we knew about human history. In the early 1960s, a joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University passed through this region. They were cataloging ancient sites across southeastern Anatolia, cumbing the layers of civilization that had accumulated in this cradle of human culture. When they reached a strange mound near Konli, they noted the presence of broken limestone slabs scattered across the surface. They observed fragments of worked stone and the telltale signs of human activity. But the team concluded that what they had found was nothing more than a medieval cemetery. Perhaps an abandoned Byzantine graveyard of no particular significance. They recorded their observations, filed their notes, and moved on to other locations they deemed more promising. The hill returned to its long silence. Seasons passed over it, and years accumulated into decades. The survey notes gathered dust in academic archives, consulted occasionally by researchers looking for something else entirely. No one suspected that beneath that unassuming mound lay the oldest known temple complex in human history, a monument that predated Stonehenge by more than 6,000 years, structure that existed before pottery, before writing, before the invention of the wheel. The greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century sat waiting in the darkness, tarried under centuries of accumulated earth, patient as only stone can be. The story of how this hidden wonder came to light begins with a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. In the autumn of 1994, Schmidt was working at another site in the region, a place called Neolithic that would soon be flooded by the waters of a new dam. He was already fascinated by the mysterious T-shaped pillars that had been found there, strange monoliths carved with animal reliefs that seemed impossibly sophisticated for their apparent age. During his research, Schmidt came across the old survey notes from the 1960s, the ones that dismissed the mound near Konli as a medieval burial ground. Something in those notes caught his attention. Perhaps it was the mention of worked limestone, or the description of the scattered fragments that seemed too large for a simple graveyard. Schmidt had spent years studying the Neolithic period, and he had developed an instinct for recognizing the signatures of ancient construction. The survey team from 3 decades earlier had seen only what they expected to see, but Schmidt read their words with different eyes. He decided that the mysterious hill deserved another look. On his first visit to Göbekli Tepe, Schmidt climbed the slopes with a growing sense of anticipation. The surface was littered with flint chips, thousands upon thousands of them, scattered like stars across the barren ground. To the untrained observer, these fragments might seem like nothing more than natural debris, but Schmidt recognized them immediately as debitage, the waste material produced when ancient toolmakers knapped stone into blades and scrapers. The sheer quantity of flint suggested that this had been a site of intensive activity, a place where countless hands had worked for countless hours. No medieval cemetery would produce such evidence. As he walked further across the mound, Schmidt began to notice rectangular shapes protruding from the earth. They were limestone blocks, their edges too straight and their surfaces too flat to be natural formations. The more he looked, the more he saw fragments of carved pillars emerging from the soil, like the fingers of buried giants reaching toward the light. His heart began to race with the recognition of what these shapes implied. This was no graveyard, okay? This was something far older and far more significant than anyone had imagined, okay? Schmidt knelt in the dust and brushed away the loose soil from one of the protruding stones. Beneath the dirt, he could make out the carved relief of an animal, its form still crisp after millennia of burial. The style was unmistakable to someone who had spent years at Navali Quarry. These were not medieval grave markers, but Neolithic monuments, and their presence here suggested a site of extraordinary importance. Schmidt later described this moment as the experience of a lifetime. The instant when he realized he had stumbled upon something that would change the way we understand our own past. The following year, in 1995, Schmidt returned with a small team to begin formal excavations. They started digging at the top of the mound, carefully removing the layers of soil that had accumulated over thousands of years. Almost immediately, they began to uncover structures of astonishing size and complexity. Massive T-shaped pillars emerged from the earth, some of them standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing as much as 20 tons. The pillars were arranged in circles, their flat faces carved with elaborate reliefs of animals and abstract symbols. At the center of each circle stood 2 larger pillars, facing each other like silent sentinels guarding some forgotten secret. The first radiocarbon dates came back from the laboratory, and they defied belief. The oldest structures at Göbekli Tepe dated to approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era, making them roughly 11,600 years old at the time of their discovery. This was more than 6 millennia before the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. It was more than 5,000 years before the sarsen stones were erected at Stonehenge. The monuments of Göbekli Tepe had been built at the end of the last ice age, when woolly mammoths still roamed the northern steppes and humanity was supposedly living in small bands of hunter-gatherers without the capacity for such monumental construction. The implications were staggering, according to the conventional understanding of human prehistory. Complex architecture required settled agricultural communities with surplus food and organized labor. Temples and monuments came after cities, which came after farming, which came after the development of pottery and other technologies. Göbekli Tepe predated all of these developments. It was built by people who had not yet learned to cultivate crops or domesticate animals. People who still followed the wild herds and gathered the gifts of the wilderness. Kano, how could such people have constructed monuments that rivaled anything built in the millennia that followed? Schmidt spent the next 2 decades of his life trying to answer that question. Year after year, he returned to the hill near Konlierfa, slowly peeling back the layers of earth to reveal more circles, more pillars, more carvings of impossible sophistication. Each season brought new revelations and new mysteries. Ground-penetrating radar surveys suggested that what had been excavated represented only a small fraction of the site. Beneath the surface lay perhaps 20 or more additional enclosures, still buried, still waiting to tell their stories. The work attracted international attention and sparked intense debate among archaeologists and historians. Some struggled to accept the dating, proposing alternative interpretations that might preserve the traditional timeline of human development. Others embraced the discovery as evidence that our ancestors were far more capable than we had given them credit for, that the line between primitive and civilized was far more blurred than our textbooks suggested. The monument on the hill became a touchstone for larger questions about who we are, where we came from, and what forces drove us to build monuments that would outlast our brief lives. Klaus Schmidt continued his excavations until his sudden death in 2014. He did not live to see the full extent of what lay beneath the hill he had rediscovered, but he understood, perhaps better than anyone, what Göbekli Tepe represented. This was not merely an archaeological site, but a window into the human soul. It's evidence of a drive toward the transcendent that predated all the trappings of civilization. The people who built these monuments had nothing that we would recognize as technology, okay? They had no written language, no metal tools, no beasts of burden to help them move the massive stones. Yet, they created something that has endured for 12,000 years. Something that still has the power to humble and astonish us. The hill with the belly had finally given up its secret, or at least the beginning of its secret. The full story of Göbekli Tepe is still being written, one careful excavation at a time, one fragment of carved stone at a time. But even what we know now is enough to transform our understanding of human prehistory, before the first grain was planted, before the first city was built, before the first word was written. Our ancestors gathered on this hill to create something sacred. They moved mountains of stone with nothing but human muscle and human will. They carved visions of animals and symbols that we still cannot fully interpret. They built a temple to purposes we can only guess at, and then, for reasons we do not understand, they buried it beneath the earth and walked away. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe is a reminder that history is never finished, that the past is always capable of surprising us. For 3 decades, the site lay hidden in plain sight, dismissed by experts who saw only what they expected to see. It took one archaeologist with fresh eyes and an open mind to recognize the truth that had been waiting there all along. How many other wonders remain buried beneath our feet, mistaken for something ordinary, passed over by those who lack the vision to see them for what they truly are. As you settle into the darkness and let these words carry you toward sleep, consider the men and women who labored on that hilltop so many thousands of years ago. They looked up at the same stars that shine through your window tonight. They felt the same wind on their faces, the same sun on their skin. They had the same hopes and fears that quicken in your own heart. They did not know that their work would endure for 12 millennia. They could not have imagined that people in a distant future would wonder at what they had made. Yet they built anyway, driven by something deep within them that demanded expression, something that connects their world to ours across the vast gulf of time. The stones of Göbekli Tepe stand as testimony to that connection, silent witnesses to the continuity of human aspiration. They remind us that we are not the first to dream of something greater than ourselves, not the first to reach for the eternal in a world of endless change. The temple on the hill was old before the pyramids were conceived, old before the gods of Egypt or Mesopotamia were given names. It was already ancient when the first bronze was smelted and the first wheel turned, and it speaks to us still, across all those centuries, in a language that requires no translation. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let the mystery of Göbekli Tepe settle over you like a blanket woven from starlight and stone. There is no need to solve its riddles now. There is no urgency to understand. Simply rest in the knowledge that our species has always been drawn to create, to build, to leave our mark upon the world. This impulse lives in you as surely as it lived in those first temple builders. You carry their legacy in your bones, in your blood, in the very structure of your mind. Let that thought bring you peace as the night deepens and the ancient stones keep their long vigil over the plains of Anatolia, waiting for the dawn that always comes. The first seasons of excavation at Göbekli Tepe unfolded like the slow revelation of a dream that no one had dared to dream. Klaus Schmidt and his small team worked methodically through the layers of compacted earth, pressing away millennia of accumulated silence, grain by grain. Each day brought new fragments to light, pieces of a puzzle that seemed to grow larger with every discovery. The archaeologists moved carefully, documenting every stone and every shard, aware that they were handling evidence of something unprecedented. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon them almost as heavily as the earth that had covered these monuments for so long. In those early years, between 1995 and the turn of the millennium, the true scale of Göbekli Tepe began to emerge from the shadows. The first complete enclosure they uncovered was a circular structure approximately 10 meters in diameter, its perimeter defined by massive T-shaped pillars set into a low stone wall. The pillars stood like figures frozen in some eternal dance, their flat faces oriented toward the center of the circle, where 2 even larger monoliths rose from the bedrock. These central pillars towered over the others, reaching heights of more than 5 meters. Their surfaces, carved with intricate reliefs that seemed to pulse with life even after thousands of years of burial. The T-shape of the pillars was immediately striking, unlike anything found at other Neolithic sites. The vertical shaft rose from a carved base, widening at the top into a horizontal element that suggested arms extending outward, or perhaps the beam of some cosmic balance. Schmidt and his colleagues quickly recognized that these were not merely structural supports, but representations of something more significant. The proportions were unmistakably human, stylized figures with their arms folded against their sides. Some of the pillars bore carved details that reinforced this interpretation, hands with fingers carefully delineated, belts or loincloths wrapped around what would be the waist, foxes or other animals depicted as if hanging from those belts, like hunting trophies. Yet despite their anthropomorphic form, the pillars had no faces. Where heads should have been, there was only the smooth, flat surface of the horizontal cap, blank and enigmatic. These were not portraits of individuals, but something more abstract, perhaps representations of ancestors, spirits, or gods whose features were too sacred or too terrible to depict. The facelessness gave the figures an unsettling presence, as if they were watching from some dimension beyond ordinary perception, seeing without eyes, knowing without the need for mortal senses. As the excavations continued, more enclosures revealed themselves beneath the soil. Each circle had its own character, its own particular arrangement of pillars, and its own repertoire of carved images. The archaeologists designated them with letters: Enclosure A, Enclosure B, Enclosure C, and so on, a clinical naming system that belied the wonder these structures inspired. The older enclosures, buried deeper in the mound, proved to be the most elaborate. The ones closer to the surface were smaller and less finely crafted, as if the tradition that created them had gradually diminished over the centuries before finally fading away entirely. The carvings on the pillars constituted a bestiary of remarkable diversity. Foxes appeared with extraordinary frequency, their sinuous bodies captured in poses of alertness and cunning. Wild boars bristled with carved bristles, their tusks curving outward in displays of primal aggression. Snakes coiled along the edges of pillars, their scales rendered with meticulous attention to detail. Cranes stood in elegant profiles, their long necks curved in attitudes of watchfulness. Scorpions raised their venomous tails, and spiders spread their legs across the limestone surface. Lions crouched as if ready to spring, and aurochs displayed their massive horns. Vultures spread their wings in postures that suggested both menace and protection. The precision of these carvings astonished everyone who examined them. The artists who created these reliefs had achieved a level of naturalistic detail that would not be seen again for thousands of years. They understood anatomy and movement, shadow and form. They could suggest the texture of fur and feather, the coiled tension of a predator about to strike, the eerie stillness of a scavenger waiting for death. These were not the crude scratching of primitive people, but the mature expressions of a sophisticated artistic tradition. The question of how such skill could exist so early in human history became one of the central mysteries of Göbekli Tepe. When the first radiocarbon dates returned from laboratories in Germany and elsewhere, they confirmed what Schmidt had suspected but hardly dared to believe. The organic materials associated with the oldest enclosures yielded dates clustering around 9600 to 9200 years before the Common Era. This placed the construction of Göbekli Tepe at the very end of the Younger Dryas, a period of sudden climate change that had plunged the world back into near glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. The builders had begun their work as the ice was finally releasing its grip on the northern hemisphere, as the world was warming and transforming into something new. These dates make Göbekli Tepe older than any other known monumental architecture by an almost incomprehensible margin. The megalithic temples of Malta, previously considered among the oldest freestanding structures in the world, dated to approximately 3,600 years before the Common Era. Stonehenge, that iconic circle on the Salisbury Plain, was begun around 3,000 years before the Common Era and completed over many centuries. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the pyramids of Egypt were younger still. Göbekli Tepe predated all of them by thousands of years, standing alone at the very beginning of the human impulse to build monuments that would outlast the builders themselves. The academic world received these findings with a mixture of excitement and skepticism. Some researchers embraced the discovery as a revolutionary insight into human prehistory, evidence that the conventional narrative of civilization's development needed fundamental revision. Others approached the claims with caution, questioning the dating methods, proposing alternative interpretations of the evidence, or simply waiting for more data before drawing conclusions. This is the normal process of science, the careful scrutiny that separates genuine discoveries from errors and exaggerations. But there was also resistance of a more stubborn kind, a reluctance to abandon familiar frameworks even in the face of compelling evidence. The conventional understanding of the Neolithic revolution had been built over more than a century of archaeological research. According to this model, the great transformation of human life began with the domestication of plants and animals in the Fertile Crescent. Agriculture allowed people to settle in permanent villages, which grew into towns and eventually cities. Surplus food freed some members of society from the constant labor of subsistence, allowing the development of specialized crafts. Hierarchical social structures, and eventually the temples and monuments that marked the emergence of civilization. Religion and monumental architecture were understood as products of this process, consequences of the agricultural revolution rather than causes of it. Göbekli Tepe challenged this narrative at its foundations. Here was a monumental complex built by people who had not yet domesticated any plants or animals, who still lived by hunting wild game and gathering wild foods. The bones found at the site came from gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, and other creatures of the wilderness, not from sheep or cattle or goats. There was no evidence of cultivated grain, no storage facilities for agricultural surplus, no indication that these people had taken the first steps toward farming. Yet they had organized themselves to quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones weighing as much as 20 tons, a feat that would seem to require exactly the kind of organized labor that agriculture was supposed to make possible. Some scholars attempted to reconcile the evidence with the traditional framework by proposing that Göbekli Tepe represented a very late stage of hunter-gatherer society, cultural flowering that occurred just before the transition to farming. Perhaps the same social pressures that drove people to build these monuments also drove them to experiment with cultivation. And the two developments were part of a single, interconnected transformation. This interpretation preserved the basic sequence of the standard model, while acknowledging that the process might have been more complex than previously understood. But Klaus Schmidt proposed something more radical. He suggested that the conventional narrative had the causation backward, rather than agriculture leading to religion and monuments. Perhaps religion and monuments led to agriculture. The need to feed the workers who built and maintained these sacred complexes might have driven the first experiments with cultivation. The desire to gather regularly at holy sites might have encouraged the shift from nomadic wandering to more settled patterns of life. In this view, Göbekli Tepe was not a late achievement of hunter-gatherer society, but the beginning of something new, the seed from which civilization would eventually grow. This hypothesis, sometimes called the Temple First theory, remained controversial throughout Schmidt's lifetime and continues to spark debate today. It inverts so many of our assumptions about human development that accepting it requires a fundamental shift in perspective. We are accustomed to thinking of religion as something that emerges from settled societies, a luxury that becomes possible only after the basic needs of survival have been secured. But what if the impulse toward the sacred is more primary than that, more fundamental to human nature than the practical innovations that made civilization possible. The evidence from Göbekli Tepe does not answer this question definitively, but it forces us to ask it in new ways. The site demonstrates beyond doubt that monumental construction was possible without agriculture. Sophisticated art could flourish among people who still followed the wild herds across the landscape. Whatever drove the builders of Göbekli Tepe to their monumental labors, it was not the surplus wealth of farming communities. It was something else, something that burned in the human spirit long before the first grain was planted or the first herd was tamed. As the excavations progressed through the early 2000s, the site continued to yield surprises. Ground-penetrating radar surveys revealed that the exposed enclosures represented only a fraction of what lay beneath the surface. Perhaps 20 or more additional circles remained buried. Their pillars still standing in the darkness, their carvings unseen by human eyes for 10,000 years. The full extent of Göbekli Tepe might take generations to uncover, and each new enclosure might bring new questions along with its answers. Schmidt worked at the site for nearly 2 decades, watching the monument emerge from the earth like a message from the ancient past. He developed theories and revised them as new evidence demanded. He trained a generation of archaeologists in the careful techniques required to excavate such a delicate site. He wrote papers and gave lectures, spreading word of the discovery to academic audiences and the general public alike. Through all those years, he never lost his sense of wonder at what the hill near Kanan Yerfa had revealed. Never grew complacent before the mystery that unfolded more fully with each passing season. The T-shaped pillars stood as they had stood for millennia, silent and patient, their blank faces turned toward the center of each circle, as if waiting for something that had never arrived. The animals carved on their surfaces seemed to move in the shadows cast by the excavation lights, foxes and snakes and vultures performing their eternal dance on the surface of the stone. Whatever ceremonies had once taken place within these circles, whatever prayers or sacrifices or ecstatic visions had animated this place, only the stones remained to testify. They spoke in a language we have not yet learned to read, but they spoke nonetheless, and those who listened carefully could hear the echo of something profound, something that reached across the vast gulf of years to touch the present moment. Let these images accompany you as you drift toward sleep. Its great pillars rising from the earth, the flickering torchlight illuminating carved beasts on ancient stone. Imagine the hands that shaped these monuments, the eyes that first beheld them complete, the voices that filled these circles with song or invocation. They are gone now, those builders, their names unrecorded, their individual lives swallowed by the immensity of time. But their work endures, and in its endurance, something of them endures as well. Rest now, and let the mystery deepen around you like the soft darkness of a winter night, full of stars, too distant to count, but present nonetheless, shining their ancient light into the waiting world. The circular enclosures of Göbekli Tepe rise from the bedrock like stone flowers blooming in slow motion across geological time. Each structure follows a similar pattern, yet each possesses its own distinct character, its own arrangement of pillars, and its own vocabulary of carved images. To walk among them, even in imagination, is to enter a space that was designed with deliberate intention. A space that channels movement and focuses attention in ways that reveal sophisticated understanding of how architecture shapes human experience. These were not random assemblages of stone, but carefully planned constructions that required vision, coordination, and an intimate knowledge of the materials from which they were made. The typical enclosure consists of a roughly circular wall built from smaller stones, tree-stacked without mortar, forming a perimeter perhaps 10 to 30 meters in diameter. Set into this wall at regular intervals stand the great T-shaped pillars, their bases sunk into sockets carved from the underlying limestone. The pillars lean slightly inward, creating a subtle sense of convergence that draws the eye toward the center of the circle. There, dominating the space, rise to larger pillars that dwarf all the others. standing parallel to each other like the focal point of some forgotten liturgy. These central monoliths can reach heights of 5.5 meters and weigh as much as 20 tons. Yet, they were positioned with evident care, their placement clearly significant to whatever purposes the enclosure served. The floors of these structures were made from terrazzo, smooth surface created by mixing powertite with limestone chips and then polishing the result to a gentle sheen. This technique, sophisticated for any era, would not be seen again in the archaeological record for thousands of years. Walking on such a floor would have been different from walking on bare earth or rough stone. The sound of footsteps would have been distinctive, the feel underfoot smooth and deliberate. Every element of these spaces was designed to create a particular atmosphere, to set apart the sacred precinct from the ordinary world that surrounded it. The walls that connected the pillars were not simply functional barriers, but were themselves crafted with attention to form and finish. Stone benches ran along the interior perimeter, providing seating for those who gathered within. In some enclosures, niches and recesses were cut into the walls, perhaps to hold offerings, sacred objects, or the flickering flames of oil lamps that would have been necessary to illuminate these spaces during nighttime ceremonies. The overall impression is one of careful design, of builders who understood that every surface and every dimension would contribute to the experience of those who entered. But it is the engineering required to create these structures that truly staggers the modern imagination. The builders of Göbekli Tepe had no metal tools. They had no wheels to help them transport heavy loads. They had no pulleys or cranes or any of the mechanical devices that later civilizations would develop to move massive stones. They had not yet domesticated oxen or horses or any animal that might serve as a beast of burden. What they had was human muscle, human ingenuity, and an apparently inexhaustible determination to achieve what should have been impossible. The limestone from which the pillars were carved came from quarries located on the slopes of the hill itself, some less than 100 meters from the enclosures. Visiting these quarries today, one can still see the evidence of ancient labor frozen in the rock. There are channels cut into the bedrock where workers separated blocks from the surrounding stone. There are half-finished pillars still attached to the limestone from which they were being carved, abandoned at various stages of completion for reasons we can only guess. One such pillar, had it been completed and erected, would have stood nearly 7 meters tall and weighed approximately 50 tons, far larger than any pillar that was actually put in place. The quarrying process required immense patience and physical effort. Without metal chisels, the workers used tools made from flint, the same material they used to make their hunting weapons and butchering implements. Flint is hard enough to cut limestone, but it fractures easily and must be constantly resharpened or replaced. Experiments by modern archaeologists have shown that carving a single pillar would have required tens of thousands of flint blades, each one laboriously knapped to an effective edge, each one worn down by hours of grinding against the stone. The mountains of flint debitage that Schmidt found scattered across the site testify to the scale of this effort. Carpet of discarded tools representing countless hours of dedicated labor. Once a pillar was roughed out from the bedrock, it had to be separated from the stone beneath it. The workers cut channels on all sides, leaving only a thin spine of rock connecting the pillar to its parent stone. Then, using wooden levers or perhaps controlled fracturing, they broke this final connection and the pillar was free. But free did not mean light. A typical pillar weighing 10 to 15 tons does not simply slide out of a quarry and walk to its intended location. It had to be moved by human power alone, across terrain that was uneven and treacherous, to a destination that might be 100 meters or more away. The methods used to transport these massive stones remain somewhat mysterious, though various theories have been proposed. Some researchers suggest that the pillars were placed on wooden sledges and dragged across the ground, perhaps with the aid of log rollers placed beneath the sledge to reduce friction. Others propose that the ground itself was prepared, leveled, and compacted to create smooth pathways along which the stones could slide. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that teams of several hundred people working with ropes and coordination can move surprisingly heavy loads using such techniques. But organizing such teams requires leadership, communication, and the ability to feed and house large numbers of workers, capacities that we do not normally associate with hunter-gatherer societies. The erection of the pillars presents its own set of challenges. The bases of the pillars were carved to fit into sockets cut from the bedrock, suggesting that the stones were lowered into position rather than simply tipped upright. This would have required ramps, scaffolding, or some combination of both. Temporary structures that have long since vanished, but that must have existed. The precision with which the pillars were positioned, their alignment with each other and with the central monoliths, indicates that the builders had methods for planning and executing complex geometric arrangements. They understood angles and distances, weight and balance, the physics of lever and fulcrum, even if they did not know these concepts by name. Consider what this implies about the society that accomplished such feats. Someone had to design these structures to conceive of the overall plan and communicate it to others. Someone had to coordinate the quarrying, ensuring that pillars of the right size were cut and finished according to the design. Someone had to organize the transport, assembling work crews, preparing equipment, and directing the actual movement of the stones. Someone had to supervise the erection, making decisions in real time about how to position each pillar, how to secure it, how to ensure it would stand for centuries to come. And someone had to feed all these workers to provide them with the calories necessary to perform such grueling physical labor day after day. The animal bones found at Göbekli Tepe provide some insight into this last question. Thousands of bone fragments have been recovered from the site, representing gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, and various other species. These were wild animals, hunted and brought to the site for butchering and consumption. The sheer quantity of bones suggests that large-scale feasting took place here, gatherings where many people consumed considerable amounts of meat. Perhaps these feasts were the reward for labor, the incentive that drew people from across the region to contribute their strength to the construction project. They were religious celebrations that accompanied key moments in the building process. Quoted their exact nature, they indicate that Göbekli Tepe was a place where significant numbers of people gathered, ate together, and presumably participated in whatever activities gave the site its meaning. The implications for our understanding of prehistoric social organization are profound. We are accustomed to thinking of hunter-gatherer societies as small-scale and egalitarian, bands of a few dozen individuals who followed the seasonal movements of game and plant resources. Such societies typically lack the hierarchical structures and specialized roles that characterize more complex civilizations. Yet the construction of Göbekli Tepe would seem to require exactly such structures and roles. Someone had to be in charge. Someone had to make decisions that others followed. Someone had to possess knowledge that others lacked, whether architectural vision, engineering skill, or religious authority. The monument itself is evidence that late Pleistocene society was more complex than we had imagined. Some researchers have proposed that the construction of Göbekli Tepe was accomplished through periodic gatherings rather than continuous labor. Hunter-gatherer groups from across the region might have come together at certain times of year, contributing labor to the project before dispersing back to their home territories. In this model, the monument accumulated slowly over many decades or even centuries, with each generation adding to what their predecessors had begun. This would explain how such construction could occur without a permanent, settled population, spreading the labor across many groups in many years. Others have suggested that the site represents a more fundamental transformation in social organization, a step toward the kind of stratified society that would later characterize agricultural civilizations. Perhaps the religious authority associated with Göbekli Tepe gave rise to new forms of leadership. Individuals or lineages that claimed special relationships with the sacred forces embodied in the monument. These leaders might have commanded the labor of others, directing construction projects that enhanced their own prestige and power. In this view, the temple was not just a product of social complexity, but a generator of it, an institution that created the very hierarchies it seemed to require. The architecture of Göbekli Tepe raises questions that reach far beyond the technical details of quarrying and construction. How did these people imagine the structures before they built them? What mental maps guided their planning? What aesthetic principles shaped their designs? How did they transmit knowledge from one generation to the next, ensuring that techniques perfected over decades would not be lost? How did they motivate workers to perform back-breaking labor without the coercive mechanisms of later states? What beliefs or values made the construction of these monuments seem not just worthwhile, but necessary, so important that every other consideration had to yield before it? We cannot answer these questions with certainty. The builders of Göbekli Tepe left no written records, no texts that might explain their intentions or describe their methods. What they left is the monument itself, stone shaped by human hands, arranged according to human designs, standing as testimony to human capabilities we had not suspected. The enclosures speak to us across the millennia, but they speak in a language of form and image rather than word and concept. We must learn to read that language if we hope to understand what these people were trying to say. As sleep approaches and your thoughts grow soft around the edges, imagine the quarries of Göbekli Tepe in the golden light of a prehistoric morning. See the workers moving among the stone, their bodies lean and strong from lives of hunting and gathering, their hands calloused from labor, their eyes bright with purpose. Hear the rhythmic sound of flint against limestone, a patient music that echoed across these hills for generations. Feel the weight of the ropes in your palms as you join 100 others in pulling a great stone toward its destined place. The pillar moves, slowly, impossibly, responding to the combined will of the assembled crowd. And when, at last, it stands upright, settling into its socket with a sound like distant thunder, something in you settles too, some ancient satisfaction at work completed. At stone, set in its proper place against the turning of the ages, rest now in that accomplishment. Let the silence of the finished enclosure wrap around you like a cloak woven from twilight and the smoke of ancient fires. The pillars stand guard through the night, as they have stood for 12,000 years, patient sentinels watching over the mysteries they were made to embody. Tomorrow, there will be more questions, more wonders to explore. But for now, let the stones keep their vigil while you drift into the welcoming dark. The surfaces of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe crawl with life. Foxes twist along the edges of the stone, their bodies rendered with such naturalistic precision that one can almost sense the coiled energy of the living animal. Snakes glide across limestone faces in sinuous curves, their scales carved in careful rows that catch the light and shadow in mesmerizing patterns. Boars bristle with carved bristles, their tusks curving outward in permanent displays of aggression. Cranes stand in elegant silhouette, their long necks curved in attitudes of alertness or perhaps ritual significance. Scorpions raise their segmented tails, and spiders spread their legs in postures that seem ready to scuttle off the stone at any moment. This menagerie of carved creatures constitutes one of the great artistic achievements of prehistoric humanity, a gallery of images that speaks across 12,000 years with undiminished power. The variety of animals represented is remarkable, but equally remarkable is which animals are absent. The people who built Göbekli Tepe hunted gazelles and wild cattle for food, yet these prey animals appear only rarely in the carvings. The dominant creatures are predators and scavengers, animals that inspired fear or commanded respect, beings that occupied the dangerous margins of the prehistoric world. Foxes appear more frequently than any other animal, their clever faces and bushy tails decorating pillar after pillar. In the mythology of many cultures, foxes are trickster figures, creatures of cunning and transformation, dwellers on the boundary between the wild and the civilized. Their prominence at Göbekli Tepe suggests that they held special significance for the builders, though the exact nature of that significance remains elusive. Snakes slither through the carved menagerie with particular abundance. They wind around the edges of pillars, coil at the bases of the great monoliths, and sometimes cluster in disturbing congregations that seem to swarm across the stone surface. In later mythologies, snakes would come to symbolize many things: wisdom and danger, death and rebirth, the underworld and the forces that dwell there. Perhaps these associations were already forming in the minds of those who carved these images so many millennia ago. The snake sheds its skin and emerges renewed. A visible miracle of transformation that must have seemed magical to people who had no scientific framework to explain it. To carve a snake into sacred stone was perhaps to invoke that power of renewal, to call upon forces that transcended ordinary existence. The birds of Göbekli Tepe are particularly striking. Vultures spread their wings in postures that dominate entire sections of certain pillars, their naked heads and hooked beaks rendered with unflinching accuracy. In one famous relief, a vulture appears to carry a human head, or perhaps a spherical object that represents a head in its talons. Cranes and other wading birds stand in dignified rows, their forms simplified but immediately recognizable. Ducks paddle across the stone as if floating on invisible waters. These avian images connect the monument to the sky, to the realm above the earth, where birds move freely between worlds. Vultures in particular, as creatures that consume the dead, may have held profound significance for people whose burial practices remain largely unknown to us. Among the most enigmatic images at Göbekli Tepe are the carved representations of what scholars have come to call handbags. These objects appear on several pillars, depicted as rectangular shapes with curved handles at the top, looking remarkably similar to modern purses or briefcases. They hover in the carved spaces above animals or alongside human arms, clearly significant but utterly mysterious in their meaning. Similar handbag motifs appear in the art of much later civilizations, including Mesopotamian reliefs where gods and protective spirits carry comparable objects. This parallel across thousands of years and thousands of miles has sparked speculation about cultural transmission, shared symbolism, or perhaps universal archetypes that arise independently in human consciousness. With these containers for sacred objects, symbols of authority, or representations of something we cannot begin to guess. Human figures appear at Göbekli Tepe, though they are far less common than the animals that dominate the carvings. When humans do appear, they are often depicted in disturbing ways. Several reliefs show headless human bodies, their necks terminating in clean lines where heads should be. One striking image depicts a headless figure with an erect phallus, surrounded by vultures and other creatures in what appears to be a scene of death or transformation. These decapitated forms suggest that the removal or collection of human heads held ritual significance for the builders, a practice documented in many prehistoric and historical cultures around the world. Skulls have been found at the site with modifications suggesting they were hung or displayed, supporting the interpretation that head-related rituals played an important role in whatever ceremonies took place within the enclosures. The T-shaped pillars themselves present the most profound enigma of representation at Göbekli Tepe. Their form is unmistakably anthropomorphic. The vertical shaft suggests a body, while the horizontal cap suggests arms extended outward. Some pillars bear carved details that reinforce this humanoid interpretation. Hands with carefully delineated fingers wrapped around the sides of the pillar, as if the figure were embracing itself or holding something against its body. Belts or loincloths encircle what would be the waist. Fox pelts and other objects hang from these belts, as if the pillar were a hunter displaying trophies. These are not abstract shapes, but representations of beings, figures frozen in stone for purposes we can only imagine. Yet, these humanoid pillars have no faces, but the head should be atop the horizontal arms. There is only the flat surface of the limestone cap, smooth and blank, and utterly without features. No eyes gaze out from these monuments. No mouths open in speech or song. The beings represented by the pillars are present, but unseeing, or perhaps seeing in ways that do not require ordinary eyes. This facelessness distinguishes them from the vivid naturalism of the animal carvings, suggesting that whatever these figures represent belongs to a different order of existence than the foxes and snakes and vultures that decorate their surfaces. Scholars have proposed various interpretations of these faceless figures. Some suggest they represent ancestors, the honored dead, whose individual features have been subsumed into a more general spiritual presence. Others propose that they are gods or spirits, beings too sacred or too powerful to be depicted with mortal faces. Still others suggest that the pillars represent priests or shamans, human mediators between the ordinary world and the realm of the supernatural. Their faces hidden because their personal identities were less important than the cosmic forces they channeled. Each interpretation has its merits, and none can be confirmed or refuted on the basis of available evidence. The animals that cover the pillars may provide clues to the identity of the faceless figures they decorate. If each pillar represents a different being, perhaps the animals constitute attributes or associations, the way saints in Christian iconography are identified by their symbolic companions. A pillar dominated by foxes might represent a deity or spirit associated with cunning and transformation. A pillar covered with snakes might embody chthonic powers, forces of the underworld or the fertile earth. A pillar bearing vultures might connect to death and the journey of the soul after the body fails. In this interpretation, the enclosures would be assemblies of spiritual powers, councils of gods or ancestors gathered around the great central pillars, like courtiers around a throne. Some researchers have proposed that the animal carvings represent totemic identifications, symbols of different clans or kinship groups that came together to build and maintain the monument. In many traditional societies, kinship groups identify with particular animals, claiming descent from or spiritual connection to creatures that serve as emblems of group identity. If different clans each contributed to the construction of Göbekli Tepe, they might have marked their contributions with carvings of their totemic animals, leaving a permanent record of their participation in the sacred enterprise. The enclosures would thus represent not only religious space, but also social structure, mapping in stone the relationships between different groups in the wider community. The three-dimensional sculptures found at Göbekli Tepe add another layer to this complex iconographic program. Unlike the reliefs carved into pillar surfaces, these sculptures stand free of the stone matrix, shaped fully in the round. They include representations of animals, human heads, and more abstract forms that resist easy interpretation. One particularly striking piece depicts a creature that combines human and animal features, a figure that might represent a shaman in animal form, a deity with hybrid nature, or some other being that transcends the categories of ordinary taxonomy. These sculptures suggest that the builders possessed not only relief carving skills, but also the ability to conceive and execute fully three-dimensional forms. Another indication of the sophisticated artistic tradition that flourished at this remote epoch. The symbols and images of Göbekli Tepe constitute a language we have not yet learned to read. They were clearly meaningful to those who carved them, important enough to warrant the enormous effort required to create them. They communicate something, but what? We can describe the images in detail. We can note patterns and repetitions. We can compare them to imagery from later cultures and propose possible interpretations based on those comparisons. But we cannot simply translate them the way we might translate a text from a known language. the mental world of the builders remains largely inaccessible, separated from us by an abyss of time and cultural difference that no amount of scholarly ingenuity can fully bridge. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps the mystery is itself meaningful, a reminder that our ancestors were not simply earlier versions of ourselves, but genuinely different people with genuinely different ways of understanding the world. The faceless pillars refuse to meet our gaze. The carved animals perform their silent dance without explanation. The handbags hang in the stone space, forever closed to our inspection. Göbekli Tepe offers us the gift of wonder, the recognition that there are depths in human experience that we have barely begun to plumb. As you settle deeper into the approaching sleep, let the images of Göbekli Tepe drift through your mind like cards shuffled by invisible hands. See the fox with its knowing eyes, the snake with its coiled potential, the vulture with its wings spread against the carved sky. See the faceless pillars standing in their eternal circles, their arms extended in gestures that might be welcome or warning, blessing or prohibition. You do not need to understand them to feel their power. You do not need to decode their meaning to sense that they meant something profound to those who made them. The carved bestiary keeps watch through the night, predators and prey frozen in limestone, their forms as fresh as the day they were cut from the living rock. Somewhere in the symbolism of these creatures lie keys to understanding how our distant ancestors imagined the world, what they feared and what they hoped, what they believed awaited them beyond the horizon of death. Those keys remain hidden for now, buried in the silence of the stone. But the search continues, and with each season of excavation, each new discovery, the picture grows a little clearer, the mystery a little more defined, if not resolved. Let that ongoing revelation accompany you into dreams. Let the carved foxes run through landscapes of your sleeping mind. Let the snakes coil in the corners of your unconscious, shedding their skins and emerging renewed with the dawn. Let the great faceless figures stand at the threshold between waking and sleeping, guardians of the passage from one state to another. They have stood at such thresholds for 12,000 years. They will stand there still when you wake refreshed to a world made more wondrous by their existence. What was Göbekli Tepe for? This question haunts every visitor to the site, every scholar who studies its remains, every curious mind that contemplates the mystery of its existence. The monument stands as one of the most impressive achievements of prehistoric humanity. Yet, its purpose remains frustratingly unclear. We can describe what we see with considerable precision. We can date the construction and analyze the materials. We can catalog the carvings and map the enclosures. But the essential question of why these people built what they built, what needs it served, what beliefs it embodied, continues to elude definitive answer. The most striking absence at Göbekli Tepe is any evidence of permanent habitation. Despite decades of excavation, archaeologists have found no houses, no hearths for daily cooking, no storage pits for grain or other provisions, no rubbish middens that would accumulate around a settlement occupied year after year. The site lacks the mundane debris of everyday life that characterizes places where people actually lived. There are no grinding stones for processing food, no spindle wheels for making thread, no pottery for cooking or storage. What remains is almost exclusively related to the construction and use of the monumental enclosures themselves. Göbekli Tepe appears to have been a place people visited rather than a place they called home. This absence of domestic evidence has led most scholars to conclude that Göbekli Tepe was a purely ceremonial site, a sacred precinct set apart from the ordinary activities of daily existence. People came here for specific purposes, participated in whatever rituals gave the place its meaning, and then departed to homes located elsewhere. The monument functioned not as a village or a town, but as something more like a cathedral or a temple, special destination that drew visitors from the surrounding region for occasions of religious significance. Its isolation from mundane life was not accidental, but intentional, part of what made the place sacred in the first place. The absence of water sources near the hilltop reinforces this interpretation. The builders chose to construct their monument on an elevated ridge rather than in a valley near springs or streams. 10. This was not a practical choice if the goal was to establish a permanent settlement. Carrying water up the slopes would have been arduous, and sustaining a resident population would have required constant effort. But if Göbekli Tepe was a pilgrimage site, visited periodically rather than inhabited continuously, the lack of water nearby would have been less problematic. Pilgrims could bring what they needed for short stays, or water could be transported to the site specifically for the duration of ceremonial gatherings. The evidence that does survive at Göbekli Tepe speaks of feasting on a massive scale. Archaeologists have recovered more than 100,000 animal bone fragments from the site, representing gazelles, aurochs, wild boar, deer, and various smaller creatures. These bones show clear signs of butchering, the cut marks and breakage patterns that indicate animals were slaughtered, processed, and consumed. The quantity of remains suggests not occasional meals, but repeated large-scale feasts. Gatherings where hundreds or perhaps thousands of people came together to eat meat in quantities that would be remarkable even by modern standards. Such feasting would have served multiple purposes beyond simple nutrition. In many traditional societies, communal meals are occasions for social bonding, for reinforcing relationships between individuals and groups, for demonstrating generosity and accumulating social prestige. The host who provides abundant food gains status and influence. Those who attend acknowledge their connection to the host and to each other. Feasting creates and maintains the social fabric, weaving together individuals who might otherwise drift apart. If gatherings at Göbekli Tepe involved feasting, they would have been as much social events as religious ones, occasions for renewing ties between groups scattered across the landscape during the rest of the year. The logistics of such feasting are themselves significant. Hunting and transporting enough game to feed large gatherings would have required coordination among multiple groups. Different hunting parties might have contributed their kills to a common supply, to pooling resources to achieve what no single band could accomplish alone. The feasts thus presupposed cooperation on a scale that challenges our assumptions about hunter-gatherer society. Someone had to organize the hunts, coordinate the contributions, manage the distribution of food. The social complexity required to stage such events may have been part of what Göbekli Tepe both expressed and helped to create. Some researchers have proposed that the gatherings at Göbekli Tepe were tied to seasonal cycles, occurring at particular times of year when conditions favored large assemblies. Perhaps people came together after major hunts, when game was abundant and there was meat to spare. Perhaps they gathered at astronomical moments, solstices, or equinoxes, or the heliacal rising of significant stars. Perhaps the timing was determined by religious calendars that tracked cycles of their own, periods of sacred time that called for pilgrimage and celebration. Whatever the schedule, the periodic nature of the gatherings would explain how a site without permanent residence could, nonetheless, be the focus of such intensive construction and use. The concept of pilgrimage offers a useful framework for understanding Göbekli Tepe. Pilgrimage sites exist in many religious traditions, places of special sanctity that draw visitors from great distances. The journey itself is often part of the spiritual experience, a period of hardship and anticipation that prepares the pilgrim for the encounter with the sacred. Arriving at the destination brings a sense of culmination, of having achieved something significant through the effort of travel. If Göbekli Tepe functioned as a pilgrimage center, the experience of approaching the hilltop after days of walking across the Anatolian plains would have heightened the emotional impact of finally seeing the great stone pillars rising against the sky. The regional context of Göbekli Tepe supports the pilgrimage interpretation. The site is not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader landscape of prehistoric monuments scattered across southeastern Turkey. Other sites with T-shaped pillars and similar imagery have been discovered in recent years, including Karahan Tepe, Navali Kori, and several others that remain largely inexcavated. These sites vary in size and elaboration, but they share enough features to suggest a common cultural tradition. Göbekli Tepe may have been the most important center in a network of sacred places, a kind of prehistoric Vatican that drew pilgrims from affiliated communities throughout the region. The relationships between these sites remain poorly understood. Their existence suggests that the religious system expressed at Göbekli Tepe was not limited to a single location. People across a wide area shared beliefs and practices that found expression in carved pillars and circular enclosures. They may have traced connections of kinship, alliance, or a spiritual lineage that linked their local shrines to the great monument on the ridge. Visiting Göbekli Tepe would have been an encounter not just with a sacred place, but with the larger community that shared their beliefs, an affirmation of identity and belonging that transcended the boundaries of individual bands and territories. What actually happened within the enclosures remains a matter of speculation. The stone benches that lined the interior walls suggest that people sat or reclined, perhaps for extended periods of watching or waiting. The central pillars, larger than the others and positioned to dominate the space, may have been the focus of attention, objects of veneration, or addresses by priests or leaders who stood before them. The animal carvings that cover every surface would have created an atmosphere dense with symbolic meaning, a visual environment that immersed visitors in the mythology and cosmology of their tradition. Flickering torchlight or oil lamps would have animated the reliefs, making the carved creatures seem to move and breathe in the dancing shadows. The terrazzo floors would have amplified the sounds within the enclosures, creating acoustic properties that may have been deliberately designed. Chanting, singing, drumming, or other forms of ritual sound production would have resonated against the stone walls and smooth floors, filling the enclosed space with vibrations that participants would have felt in their bodies, as well as heard with their ears. Some researchers have explored the acoustics of similar ancient structures and found evidence that our ancestors understood and exploited the sonic properties of their monuments. Whether the same was true at Göbekli Tepe remains to be demonstrated, but the possibility adds another dimension to our imagination of what might have occurred within those circles. The absence of clear evidence for specific rituals leaves room for many possibilities. Perhaps initiations took place here, young people undergoing transformative experiences that marked their passage into adulthood or their admission to religious societies. Perhaps healings were attempted, the sick brought to the sacred place in hopes that the powers dwelling there might cure their afflictions. Perhaps marriages were solemnized, alliances sealed, disputes arbitrated by the authority of the sacred precinct and those who presided over it. Perhaps the dead were commemorated, their memories honored, and their spirits addressed in ceremonies that maintained the connection between the living and those who had gone before. The multiple enclosures at Göbekli Tepe may indicate that different ceremonies required different spaces, or that different groups had their own dedicated areas within the larger complex. The variation in animal imagery between enclosures suggests that each had its own distinct character, its own association with particular beings or powers or social groups. Entering one enclosure rather than another might have been a choice laden with meaning, in alignment with one set of symbols rather than another. The complex as a whole would have offered a rich menu of ritual possibilities, accommodating the varied needs and affiliations of those who made the pilgrimage to its heights. As sleep draws closer and your breathing deepens, imagine yourself approaching Göbekli Tepe across the ancient landscape. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the plains, and the ridge rises before you like a promise against the darkening sky. You have walked for days to reach this place, following paths your parents and grandparents followed before you. The ache in your legs is nothing compared to the anticipation in your heart. Tonight, you'll enter the sacred enclosure. Tonight, you will stand before the great pillars and feel the presence of powers older than memory. The stone circles wait in the gathering dusk, patient as they have always been, ready to receive another generation of seekers. The carved animals seem to stir as the light fails, foxes and snakes and vultures preparing for the ceremonies that darkness brings. Somewhere in the distance, drums begin to sound, calling the scattered pilgrims together for what is to come. You quicken your pace, drawn forward by rhythms that pulse in your blood like a second heartbeat. The temple on the hill opens before you, its mysteries intact, its meaning waiting to be revealed to those who have made the journey. Let that anticipation carry you across the threshold of sleep. Let the drums fade into the rhythm of your own breathing. Let the ancient pilgrimage become a journey inward toward the sacred spaces that exist within every human heart. Göbekli Tepe have kept their vigil for 12,000 years. They will keep it still as you rest, guardians of secrets that time has not yet surrendered, monuments to purposes that transcend the boundaries of any single life. Who were the people who built Göbekli Tepe? This question reaches beyond the monuments themselves into the fabric of prehistoric life, into the daily existence of men and women who lived and died 11,000 years before our time. They left no written records, no names carved into the stone alongside their images of foxes and vultures. They exist for us only through the things they made and the traces they left behind, fragments from which we must reconstruct entire worlds of experience and belief. Yet those fragments tell a story that challenges many of our assumptions about what hunter-gatherer life was like and what it was capable of achieving. The builders of Göbekli Tepe belong to what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a stretch of time between roughly 10,000 and 7,000 years before the Common Era, when people in the Fertile Crescent were beginning the long transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. The term pre-pottery indicates that these cultures had not yet developed the ceramic technology that would become ubiquitous in later periods. They cooked in stone vessels or skin bags, stored goods in baskets or pits, and managed their lives without the fired clay containers that we associate with settled village existence. They stood at the threshold between two worlds, the ancient world of mobile foragers and the new world of agricultural communities. That would eventually give rise to cities and civilizations. The diet of these people was based on wild resources. They hunted gazelles across the open grasslands, stalking herds that migrated with the seasons. They pursued wild cattle, the massive aurochs whose horns could span a meter or more, dangerous prey that required courage and skill to bring down. They trapped wild boar in the thickets and hunted deer in the woodlands. They gathered wild grains, the ancestors of wheat and barley that grew in dense stands across the foothills of the Taurus and Zagros mountains. They collected nuts and fruits, roots and tubers, a varied menu that changed with the seasons and the movements of their bands across the landscape. Their tools were made from stone, bone, and wood. Flint knappers produced blades of remarkable fineness, sharp enough to butcher a carcass or shave a hide. Bone was carved into needles and awls, points and ornaments. Wood served 4 handles and shafts, 4 containers and shelters, though little of it survives in the archaeological record. These were not crude implements, but sophisticated technologies refined over tens of thousands of years of human experience. The flint tools found at Göbekli Tepe represent a culmination of traditions stretching back to the earliest days of our species, perfected through countless generations of trial and improvement. The social organization of these hunter-gatherer bands has traditionally been imagined as simple and egalitarian. Anthropological studies of modern foraging societies have suggested that such groups typically consist of a few dozen individuals, mobile and flexible, without strong hierarchies or permanent leadership. Resources are shared, decisions made by consensus, and no one accumulates significantly more wealth or power than anyone else. This model has served as the default assumption for understanding all prehistoric hunter-gatherers, baseline against which the later development of complex societies can be measured. But Göbekli Tepe does not fit comfortably within this model. The construction of the monument required organization on a scale that seems to exceed the capacities of small egalitarian bands. Someone had to conceive the overall design and communicate it to others. Someone had to coordinate the labor of quarrying, transporting, carving, and erecting the massive pillars. Someone had to provision the workers, ensuring that enough food was available to sustain intensive physical labor over extended periods. These are functions that require authority, planning, had the ability to mobilize resources beyond what any individual or small group could provide. The monument itself is evidence that late Pleistocene society in this region was more complex than the standard model suggests. Some researchers have responded to this challenge by proposing that Göbekli Tepe represents a rare or exceptional achievement, a peak of capability that most hunter-gatherer societies never approached. Perhaps unique conditions in southeastern Turkey allowed the development of social complexity that did not occur elsewhere. Perhaps a particularly charismatic leader or a particularly powerful religious movement temporarily galvanized cooperation on a scale that could not be sustained over time. In this view, Göbekli Tepe would be an anomaly rather than a representative example of what hunter-gatherers could accomplish. Others have suggested that our model of prehistoric hunter-gatherer society needs revision. Perhaps small egalitarian bands were not the universal condition, but one possibility among many. A social form that emerged under certain ecological conditions, but not others. The rich environment of the Fertile Crescent at the end of the Ice Age may have supported larger and more complex societies than the deserts or tundras, where most modern foraging peoples have been studied. If so, Göbekli Tepe might be less anomalous than it appears, a product of conditions that were once more common than they later became. The most radical interpretation of Göbekli Tepe reverses the traditional understanding of how civilization developed. According to the standard narrative, agriculture came first, providing the surplus food that allowed populations to grow and settle in permanent villages. Only after these economic foundations were in place could complex social organization and monumental architecture emerge. Religion and temples were consequences of the agricultural revolution, elaborations that became possible once the basic needs of survival were secured. First the farm, then the village, then the temple. But Klaus Schmidt proposed that Göbekli Tepe tells a different story. Here we have a monumental temple complex built by people who had not yet adopted agriculture, who still lived by hunting wild game and gathering wild plants. The traditional sequence is inverted. Perhaps it was the temple that came first, the religious imperative to gather and build and worship together. Perhaps the need to feed the workers who constructed these monuments, the need to provision the pilgrims who visited them, drove the first experiments with cultivation. Perhaps agriculture was not the cause of complex society, but its consequence, a practical adaptation to religious demands that could not be met by foraging alone. This hypothesis, sometimes called the temple first theory or the religion first theory, remains controversial. Not all archaeologists accept that the evidence supports such a dramatic revision of the standard model. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the origins of agriculture is complex and still being investigated, but the hypothesis has the virtue of taking seriously what the monument itself seems to demonstrate, that the human drive toward the sacred is not a luxury that follows economic development, but, its fundamental impulse that may itself drive economic and social change. The discovery of additional sites with T-shaped pillars and similar imagery has strengthened the case that Göbekli Tepe was part of a broader cultural phenomenon. Karahan Tepe, located roughly 35 kilometers to the southeast, has emerged in recent years as perhaps the most important of these related sites. Excavations there have revealed structures that may be even older than the oldest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, pushing the origins of this tradition back even further into the depths of prehistory. The carvings at Karahan Tepe include the same repertoire of animals found at Göbekli Tepe, along with striking human figures and enigmatic abstract symbols. One of the most remarkable discoveries at Karahan Tepe is a chamber carved directly into the bedrock. Its walls lined with pillar-like protrusions that seem to emerge from the living rock. In the center of this chamber stands a striking sculpture of a human figure, its features more clearly rendered than the faceless pillars of Göbekli Tepe. The figure holds its hands before its body in a gesture of uncertain meaning, its eyes open and staring across the millennia at those who enter its presence. Its more representational approach to human imagery suggests variation within the broader tradition, different communities exploring different possibilities within a shared symbolic framework. Other sites in the region are only beginning to be explored. Harput Suvan, Tepesi, Sefer, Tepe, Tasli, Tepe, Te, and several others have yielded evidence of T-shaped pillars or related architectural features. Together, these sites define a ritual landscape extending across hundreds of square kilometers, a network of sacred places connected by shared beliefs and practices. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not isolated innovators, but participants in a regional tradition that may have included thousands of individuals spread across numerous communities. This emerging picture of a ritual landscape raises new questions about social organization in the pre-pottery Neolithic. How were relationships between these communities maintained? How did people coordinate their beliefs and practices across such distances? Were there religious specialists who traveled between sites, carrying knowledge and authority from one community to another? Were there periodic gatherings that brought people from across the region together, occasions for exchange, alliance building, and the reinforcement of shared identity? The monuments cannot answer these questions directly, but they demonstrate that such coordination existed, that something held these scattered communities together in a web of common purpose. The transition to agriculture was already underway in this region during the period when Göbekli Tepe was in use. Wild grains were being harvested and perhaps experimentally cultivated. Wild animals were being managed in ways that would eventually lead to domestication. The people who built the monument stood at a pivotal moment in human history, participating in processes that would transform human existence forever. Whether religion drove that transformation or merely accompanied it remains an open question. But the monuments they left behind testify to the complexity of their world, a complexity that defies simple narratives of primitive people taking their first tentative steps toward civilization. As the night deepens and your thoughts grow quiet, consider the lives of those ancient builders. They woke each morning to a world without writing, without metal, without any of the technologies we consider essential to civilized life. Yet, they were not primitive in any meaningful sense. They were fully human, possessed of the same cognitive capacities that allow you to understand these words, to imagine distant times, to wonder about the meaning of existence. They loved and grieved, hoped and feared, created beauty and confronted mortality. They looked up at the same stars that shine outside your window tonight and asked the same questions that still echo in the human heart. The monuments they built were answers to those questions, or at least attempts at answers, expressions of meaning and purpose carved into enduring stone. We may never fully understand what those answers meant to those who gave them. The distance between their world and ours is too vast, the evidence too fragmentary, the conceptual gulf too wide. But we can recognize the impulse that drove them, the need to make sense of existence, to create order in the face of chaos, to leave something behind that would outlast the brief span of individual life. That impulse lives in us still, the inheritance of ancestors who dreamed in stone long before history began. Let their dreams mingle with yours as you drift toward sleep. Let the boundary between past and present soften. allowing the ancient and the modern to meet in the timeless space of rest. The builders of Göbekli Tepe found their peace 12,000 years ago. Their bones long since returned to the earth they walked, but something of them endures in the monuments they made, and something of those monuments endures in you. A descendant of the same human story that began so long ago and continues still in every breath you take, every dream you dream, every wonder you feel before the mysteries of the world. One of the most perplexing aspects of Göbekli Tepe is not how it was built, but how it was buried. Sometime around 8,000 years before the Common Era, after centuries of use and construction, the people of this region made a decision that defies easy explanation. They deliberately filled in the enclosures they had labored so hard to create. They packed earth and rubble around the great T-shaped pillars, burying them to their very tops. They covered the carved reliefs with tons of debris, hiding the foxes and snakes and vultures from the light of day. In a relatively short span of time, the temple complex that had dominated this hilltop for perhaps 2,000 years vanished beneath an artificial mound of compacted fill. The evidence for deliberate burial is unmistakable. The material that covers the enclosures is not wind-blown sediment accumulated gradually over millennia. It is a heterogeneous mixture of limestone fragments, flint tools, animal bones, and broken objects, the kind of debris that results from intentional dumping rather than natural deposition. The fill contains artifacts from the same cultural tradition that built the monuments, suggesting that the burial was carried out by people who were themselves connected to the site rather than by later invaders or strangers. The process must have required considerable effort, perhaps as much effort as the original construction. Hundreds or thousands of workers would have been needed to gather, transport, and deposit the cubic meters of material necessary to cover the enclosures completely. Why would anyone bury a sacred site that had been the focus of such devotion? This question has generated considerable speculation among scholars and popular writers alike. The very strangeness of the act invites interpretation, demands some explanation that makes sense of what otherwise seems senseless. Several theories have been proposed, each attempting to account for the evidence in terms of beliefs and motivations we might recognize. One possibility is that the burial was an act of protection or preservation. Perhaps the people of the region believed that the powers embodied in the monument needed to be shielded from some danger, sealed away from a world that had become unworthy or unsafe. Burying a sacred site might be understood as putting it to sleep, preserving its potency for a future time when it might be needed again. In this interpretation, the fill that covers the enclosures would be not a destruction, but a cocoon, a protective layer meant to safeguard something precious until conditions were right for its reawakening. Another theory suggests that the burial marked the end of an era, a deliberate closing of one chapter in the religious history of the region. Perhaps the beliefs and practices associated with Göbekli Tepe had evolved or been superseded by new traditions that required the old to be put away. Burying the monument would be a way of acknowledging its importance while simultaneously declaring that its time had passed. The act might have been accompanied by ceremonies of farewell, rituals of closure that honored what the site had meant, while accepting that the future demanded something different. Some researchers have proposed that the burial was connected to changing social conditions in the region. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, agriculture was becoming established throughout the Fertile Crescent. Villages were growing, populations were increasing, and the mobile foraging lifestyle that had characterized the builders of Göbekli Tepe was giving way to more settled patterns of existence. Perhaps the monument and the traditions it represented belonged to an older way of life that was becoming obsolete. Burying the site might have been a way of marking this transition, of physically interring a past that no longer fit the emerging present. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the development of agriculture adds poignancy to this interpretation. If Klaus Schmidt was right that religious gatherings at the site helped drive the shift toward cultivation, then the monument may have contained the seeds of its own obsolescence. The very success of the agricultural revolution it helped initiate may have made the pilgrimage traditions associated with Göbekli Tepe increasingly impractical. As people settled into permanent villages and became tied to their fields, the seasonal journeys to distant sacred sites may have become harder to maintain. The temple that had once drawn scattered bands together from across the region may have lost its function as those bands transformed into farming communities with their own local shrines and practices. There is also the possibility that the burial was prompted by more specific events or circumstances that we cannot reconstruct from the available evidence, perhaps a natural disaster, a plague, a war, or some other catastrophe led people to conclude that the site had become contaminated or dangerous. Perhaps the death of a particularly important religious leader left the community without the knowledge needed to continue the traditions properly. Perhaps factional conflicts between different groups led to the deliberate destruction or concealment of a site associated with rivals. The silence of the archaeological record on such matters leaves room for endless speculation without providing the evidence needed to choose among alternatives. Whatever the reason for the burial, the consequences were profound. The monument that had dominated the religious landscape of southeastern Turkey for centuries disappeared from view and from memory. The generations that followed the burial lived on the same hills, hunted the same valleys, farmed the same fields, but they seem to have had no knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. The cultural continuity that might have preserved memories of Göbekli Tepe was apparently broken. The tradition interrupted so completely that even the existence of the site was forgotten. This cultural amnesia raises questions about the transmission of knowledge in prehistoric societies. How could something so monumental, so laboriously constructed, so central to the religious life of an entire region, be forgotten so completely? The answer may lie in the nature of oral tradition and the vulnerability of knowledge that is not written down. In societies without writing, information passes from generation to generation through spoken word and demonstrated practice. Each transmission provides an opportunity for loss or distortion. If the chain of transmission is broken, if a generation dies without passing on what it knows, the knowledge can vanish as completely as if it had never existed. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe may have been accompanied by deliberate suppression of memory. If the site was being closed because its traditions were no longer wanted, those who carried out the burial might have actively discouraged discussion of what had been interred. The young might have been told that the old ways were gone, that the mound on the hilltop was simply a natural feature, that the stories of their grandparents were no longer relevant. Within a few generations, living memory would fade. Within a few centuries, even the vaguest awareness that something had once been different might disappear. The field that covered the enclosures protected them from the erosion and damage that would otherwise have destroyed them over the millennia. The same burial that erased cultural memory preserved physical remains. When Klaus Schmidt began his excavations in 1995, he found pillars still standing in their original positions, reliefs still crisp despite their age, structures remarkably intact beneath their protective blanket of debris. The act of concealment became, inadvertently, an act of preservation. What was hidden from one set of descendants was saved for others who would come much later. For more than 9,000 years, Göbekli Tepe remained buried and forgotten. Empires rose and fell across the lands that surrounded it. The Sumerians built their ziggurats, the Egyptians their pyramids, the Greeks their temples, the Romans their forums. Civilizations developed writing and lost it, discovered truths and forgot them, created wonders and watched them crumble. All the while, beneath its mound of earth and stone, the oldest temple in the world waited in darkness, its carved animals frozen in postures of eternal alertness, its faceless pillars gazing at nothing through the long millennia of burial. The people who lived near the site over those 9,000 years had no idea what lay beneath their pastures. They grazed their sheep and goats on the slopes of the mound, plowed their fields in the valleys below, lived their lives in complete ignorance of the monument that predated everything they knew of history. Occasionally, a farmer might turn up a worked stone or a fragment of carved relief, but such finds would have seemed merely curious, perhaps remnants of some relatively recent ruin rather than evidence of profound antiquity. The cultural context that might have made sense of such discoveries have been lost too long ago to recover. Even the early archaeologists who surveyed the region in the 1960s saw nothing significant. They noted the presence of worked stone and interpreted it as evidence of a medieval cemetery. Their expectations shaped their perception, leading them to see what made sense within their existing framework rather than what was actually there. The monument remained hidden, not only beneath the earth, but beneath assumptions about what was possible in the deep past. It took fresh eyes and a willingness to question those assumptions before the truth could be recognized. The story of Göbekli Tepe's burial and rediscovery carries lessons that extend beyond archaeology. It reminds us how fragile memory can be, how easily the achievements of one era can be forgotten by those who come after. It challenges our confidence that important things will naturally be remembered. Greatness inevitably leaves lasting traces. The builders of Göbekli Tepe created something extraordinary, something that required vision and labor and devotion on a massive scale. Yet, within a few generations of its burial, it was as if they had never existed. Their monument survived only because it was hidden, preserved by the very act that erased it from human consciousness. As you drift toward the borderlands of sleep, consider the layers of forgetting that separate you from your own ancestors. How many wonders have they created that you will never know about? How many truths have they discovered that have been lost before reaching you? The past is not a continuous record, but a palimpsest of fragments, survivals, and silences. What we know is dwarfed by what we have forgotten, and what we have forgotten is dwarfed by what was never recorded in the first place. Göbekli Tepe survived its forgetting through the accident of burial. How many other Göbekli Tepes lie beneath the surface of history, never to be recovered? Let this thought accompany you into the territory of dreams. Let the buried temple be a symbol of all that waits beneath the surface of awareness, truths and memories and possibilities hidden beneath the accumulations of daily life. Just as the monument was preserved by its concealment, perhaps there are treasures within you that have been buried by circumstance, protected from the erosions of time, waiting for the moment when someone with fresh eyes might recognize their value. Sleep now, and let the layers settle over you like protective earth, preserving what is precious until the time for revelation arrives. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe stood in darkness for 9,000 years, patient beyond any human patience, faithful beyond any human fidelity. Did not know they were waiting. They did not hope for rediscovery. They simply endured, as stone endures, indifferent to time and change. And when at last the light returned, and careful hands brushed away the soil of ages and revealed the carvings to the sun once more, they received that light without surprise or gratitude. They were what they had always been, monuments to something that transcended the brief flickering of human generations, testaments to purposes that outlast forgetting itself. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe sent ripples through the world of archaeology that continue to spread today. Care was evidence that demanded a fundamental reassessment of how we understand the origins of civilization. A monument so old and so sophisticated that it could not be accommodated within existing frameworks without significant revision. The implications extended far beyond the particulars of one site in southeastern Turkey, touching on some of the most basic questions we ask about human history. When did complex society begin? What drove its development? What were our ancestors capable of achieving before the technologies and institutions we consider essential to civilization had been invented? The traditional narrative of civilization's emergence had been constructed over more than a century of archaeological research, primarily focused on the ancient Near East. According to this story, the crucial turning point was the Neolithic revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture that began in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago. Farming provided a more reliable food supply than foraging, allowing populations to grow and settle in permanent villages. Surplus food freed some members of society from the constant labor of subsistence, enabling the development of craft specialization, social hierarchy, and eventually the full apparatus of civilization: cities, writing, temples, kings, and all the rest. This narrative placed agriculture at the foundation of everything that followed. It's the necessary precondition for all subsequent human achievement. Göbekli Tepe challenged this narrative at its most fundamental level. Here was a monumental complex built before agriculture, before pottery, before settled village life. The people who quarried and carved and erected these massive stones were still hunter-gatherers, still dependent on wild resources for their survival. Yet they had created something that seemed to require exactly the kinds of social complexity that agriculture was supposed to make possible. The sequence of the traditional narrative was disrupted, its causal logic called into question. If monuments could precede farming, then perhaps farming was not the foundation we had assumed it to be. Perhaps something else had come first, something that drove the agricultural revolution rather than being driven by it. Klaus Schmidt proposed that this something else was religion, the need to gather at sacred sites, to build monuments that embodied shared beliefs, to conduct rituals that required specialized knowledge and coordinated labor, may have created pressures that led to the domestication of plants and animals. Feeding the workers who built the temples, visioning the pilgrims who visited them, may have driven the first experiments with cultivation. In this view, the temple was not a luxury that followed economic development, but a necessity that preceded it. The human drive toward the sacred was the engine of civilization, not its byproduct. This hypothesis, radical as it seemed, found support in the emerging picture of the broader region. As more sites with T-shaped pillars were discovered, as the ritual landscape of the pre-pottery Neolithic came into focus, it became clear that Göbekli Tepe was part of a regional phenomenon of considerable extent and duration. Religious practices of significant complexity were widespread in southeastern Turkey before farming became established. It's the traditional assumption that religion was a late development, an elaboration that became possible only after basic needs were secured, seemed increasingly untenable in light of this evidence. The academic response to these findings was varied. Some scholars embraced the new interpretation enthusiastically, seeing in Göbekli Tepe confirmation of insights that had been emerging from other lines of evidence. Anthropologists studying contemporary foraging societies had long noted the importance of ritual and religion in organizing social life, and the monument seemed to validate the idea that such concerns could motivate impressive collective achievements. Researchers interested in cognitive evolution saw the site as evidence of sophisticated symbolic thinking and social coordination at a very early date. The discovery opened new lines of inquiry and stimulated fresh thinking across multiple disciplines. Other scholars approached the claims with more caution. The dating of the site, while robust, was based on a limited number of samples and might be subject to revision as more data became available. The interpretation of the structures as purely religious might be too narrow, overlooking possible domestic or economic functions that had not left obvious traces. The hypothesis that religion drove agriculture was elegant, but difficult to test directly. The absence of evidence for permanent habitation might reflect the limits of excavation rather than the actual nature of the site. Science proceeds by skepticism as well as by enthusiasm, and the skeptics played an important role in refining and testing the claims being made. The debate about Göbekli Tepe became part of a larger conversation about the nature of prehistoric society. Were hunter-gatherers inherently simple, or could they achieve remarkable complexity under the right conditions? Was the transition to agriculture a sudden revolution, or a gradual process extending over millennia? How should we understand the relationship between economic systems, social organization, and religious belief? These questions had been asked before, but Göbekli Tepe gave them new urgency and new evidence to consider. The site became a touchstone in discussions that extended far beyond archaeology into philosophy, chaology, and the nature of human existence itself. Klaus Schmidt remained at the center of these debates until his sudden death in July of 2014. He suffered a heart attack while swimming in Germany, far from the Turkish hills where he had spent so much of his life. He was 60 years old, still actively directing excavations, still publishing his findings, still refining his interpretations in light of new evidence. His death was a shock to the archaeological community and a profound loss for the study of Göbekli Tepe. No one understood this site as deeply as he did, and no one had devoted as many years to uncovering its secrets. Schmidt did not live to see the full impact of his discovery on public consciousness. In the years since his death, Göbekli Tepe has become increasingly famous. It's featured in documentaries, magazine articles, and popular books. It has been designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, attracting tourists from around the world who come to see the place that rewrites history. The Turkish government has invested in infrastructure and visitor facilities, transforming what was once a remote excavation into a major cultural destination. Schmidt would surely have had mixed feelings about this popularization. Pleased that his work had reached a wide audience, but perhaps concerned about the pressures that tourism places on archaeological sites. The excavations have continued under new leadership, and the site continues to yield surprises. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed that much of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated, that the known enclosures represent only a fraction of what lies beneath the surface. New techniques of analysis have provided additional insights into the diet, health, and origins of the people who gathered here. Comparisons with other sites in the region have enriched our understanding of the cultural context within which the monument was created. The work that Schmidt began is far from finished, and each season of excavation adds to our knowledge while raising new questions. The legacy of Klaus Schmidt extends beyond the specific findings at Göbekli Tepe to the example he set of patient, meticulous investigation pursued over decades. He resisted the temptation to sensationalize his discoveries, presenting his interpretations carefully and acknowledging their provisional nature. He welcomed collaboration with researchers from other disciplines, recognizing that understanding such a complex site required expertise beyond any single field. He trained a generation of students in his methods and his approach, ensuring that the work would continue after he was gone. In an era when academic success often depends on quick publications and dramatic claims, Schmidt exemplified a more deliberate and ultimately more reliable approach to knowledge. The debates that Göbekli Tepe has sparked will continue for many years to come. New evidence will emerge that supports or challenges current interpretations. New theories will be proposed that attempt to make sense of what we know. The relationship between religion and agriculture, between social complexity and economic foundations, between the deep past and the present will continue to be explored and contested. This is as it should be. Science does not advance by arriving at final answers, but by asking better questions, by testing hypotheses against evidence, by remaining open to the possibility that cherished assumptions might be wrong. What Göbekli Tepe has already demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt is that our ancestors were more capable than we had imagined. 12,000 years ago, people with no metal tools, no wheels, no domesticated animals, no writing, organized themselves to create monuments of impressive scale and sophistication. They did so not to store grain or protect against enemies, but to express beliefs and maintain traditions that mattered to them more than physical comfort or material security. The monument they created has outlasted everything that came after it, surviving while empires rose and fell. while new religions emerged and ancient ones were forgotten, while the very landscape around it was transformed by millennia of human activity. As sleep approaches and the weight of the day lifts from your shoulders, consider what it means that such a place exists. Somewhere in the genetic and cultural heritage that connects you to those ancient builders lies the same impulse that moved them to carve stone with flint and raise pillars toward the sky. You are not separate from them, but continuous with them, a later chapter in the same long story. The questions they ask about existence, meaning, and what lies beyond the horizon of death are questions you have asked as well. The need they felt to create something lasting, something that would outlive their brief individual spans, is a need you have felt too. Klaus Schmidt lies in his own grave now, his work incomplete, his questions unanswered. But the monument he gave his life to, revealing, stands still on the hill near Canal Yerfa, receiving visitors who come from every corner of the world to witness what human beings could accomplish at the very dawn of civilization. The pilgrims of today are different from the pilgrims of 12,000 years ago, yet perhaps not so different after all. Both come seeking something, drawn by the power of a place that speaks to needs deeper than any surface difference of culture or belief. Let that continuity comfort you as you drift toward sleep. Let the thought of all those generations stretching back to the builders and forward to whatever descendants will follow you weave a fabric of connection that holds you safe through the night. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have witnessed more sunrises than any human mind can comprehend. They will witness many more after you and everyone you know has returned to the earth from which we all emerged. There is peace in that thought, a release from the burden of individual importance into the larger story of which each of us is a small but irreplaceable part. Rest now in that larger story. Let the ancient stones stand guard over your sleeping consciousness. Let the carved foxes and snakes keep watch while you are absent from waking. Tomorrow, the mystery will continue. The excavations will proceed. The questions will multiply. But for now, let it all rest, as the buried temple rested for 9,000 years, patient and faithful, holding its secrets until the time was right for revelation. Beneath the surface of Göbekli Tepe, hidden from view but revealed by modern technology, lie secrets that have yet to be uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted over the past 2 decades have painted a picture of the site that extends far beyond what excavation has brought to light. The enclosures that visitors can see today, impressive as they are, represent only a small portion of what remains buried beneath the hilltop. Perhaps 20 or more additional structures lie waiting in the darkness, their pillars still standing, their carvings unseen by human eyes for 10,000 years. The known site is merely the visible tip of a much larger monument, an archaeological iceberg whose full dimensions we are only beginning to comprehend. The radar images show circular anomalies scattered across the mound, each one roughly the size and shape of the excavated enclosures. They cluster in certain areas and thin out in others, suggesting patterns of organization that we do not yet understand. Some of the unexcavated structures appear to be larger than any that have been uncovered, hinting at architectural achievements that might exceed even the impressive examples already known. The technology cannot tell us what carvings adorn these buried pillars. What animals dance across their surfaces? What symbols mark their edges? That knowledge awaits the slow and painstaking work of excavation, a process that will take decades to complete if it is ever finished at all. The decision about what to excavate and what to leave buried involves difficult calculations. Every excavation disturbs the very evidence it seeks to reveal. Once the structure is uncovered, it becomes vulnerable to erosion, weathering, and the simple wear of human presence. The fill that has protected these monuments for millennia is removed forever, and the stones must be preserved by other means. There is an argument for leaving much of Göbekli Tepe unexcavated, preserving it for future generations who may have better techniques. Questions better ways of extracting information from the ancient remains. The buried enclosures are not going anywhere. They have waited 9,000 years and can wait longer still, yet the urge to know presses against his caution. What might those buried pillars reveal that the excavated ones have not? What variations in imagery, what new symbols, what unexpected architectural features might transform our understanding of the site? The radar surveys tantalize without satisfying, revealing the presence of buried wonders without telling us what they contain. Each unexcavated enclosure is a sealed chamber of possibility, a question that only digging can answer. The tension between preservation and discovery runs through every archaeological project. But at Göbekli Tepe, it takes on particular intensity because the stakes seem so high, the potential revelations so significant. Among the most intriguing mysteries that await resolution are the symbols carved into the pillars alongside the animal reliefs. These marks are not pictures of recognizable creatures, but abstract shapes whose meaning remains opaque. There are H-like forms and crescent shapes, circles and rectangles, patterns that repeat across multiple pillars, and patterns that appear only once. Some researchers have proposed that these symbols constitute a form of proto-writing. It's an early system for recording information that predates the cuneiform of Mesopotamia and the hieroglyphs of Egypt by thousands of years. If this interpretation is correct, Göbekli Tepe would push back the origins of symbolic communication far earlier than currently accepted. The claim that these symbols represent writing or proto-writing remains highly controversial. Writing, in a strict sense used by most scholars, involves the systematic representation of language through visual marks, a way of encoding speech so that it can be recovered by a reader who knows the system. The symbols at Göbekli Tepe show no clear evidence of encoding language in this way. They might instead be emblems or badges, marks of identity or affiliation that conveyed meaning without representing words or sounds. They might be tally marks or mnemonic devices, aids to memory rather than records of speech. They might be purely decorative, patterns pleasing to the eye without any semantic content at all. Without more evidence, we cannot determine which of these possibilities is correct. The desire to find writing at Göbekli Tepe reflects a broader hope that the site might yield direct communication from the deep past, a message that we could decode and understand in something like its original terms. The animal carvings speak to us powerfully, but they speak in images rather than words, and images are open to multiple interpretations. Writing, if it existed, might tell us what the builders themselves thought about their creation, what purposes they intended, what beliefs they held. The silence of the symbols, their refusal to yield a clear meaning, frustrates this hope while simultaneously preserving the mystery that makes the site so compelling. Another area of intense speculation concerns possible astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe. Some researchers have proposed that the enclosures were oriented toward specific points on the horizon where significant celestial events occurred, the rising or setting of particular stars, the position of the sun at solstices or equinoxes. If true, this would suggest that the builders possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and incorporated it into their monumental architecture, connecting their sacred spaces to the movements of the heavens. Such connections would link Göbekli Tepe to a tradition of astronomical monuments that includes Stonehenge, Newgrange, and many other ancient sites around the world. The evidence for astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe is contested. Measuring the orientation of structures that have been buried and partially disturbed over millennia is technically challenging. The statistical significance of any apparent alignments must be carefully evaluated, since random orientations will occasionally coincide with astronomical features by chance alone. Critics argue that the proposed alignments are not precise enough to demonstrate intentional astronomical reference, that the builders could have achieved such orientations without any astronomical knowledge, simply by building in roughly similar directions. Proponents counter that the consistency of certain orientations across multiple enclosures suggests deliberate planning, that the astronomical interpretations fit within a broader pattern of evidence for sophisticated understanding of the natural world. The debate about astronomical alignments reflects a deeper tension in the interpretation of Göbekli Tepe, a tension between scientific caution and the human desire for transcendent meaning. The site is so old, so impressive, so mysterious that it invites speculation that goes beyond what the evidence can strictly support. It would be wonderful if the builders had encoded sophisticated astronomical knowledge in their monuments. The symbols carved alongside the animals were messages that we might someday decode. If the entire complex were a cosmic map or a spiritual machine of some kind. Such interpretations satisfy a longing for connection with the deep past, a desire to find in our ancestors the same hunger for meaning that we feel ourselves. But science requires us to temper this longing with rigor, to distinguish between what we hope might be true and what the evidence actually demonstrates. The animal carvings are certainly there, their artistry beyond dispute. The T-shaped pillars with their anthropomorphic forms are certainly there, their strangeness undeniable. The scale of the construction and the age of the site are established beyond reasonable doubt, but the specific beliefs of the builders, the exact purposes of the enclosures, the meaning of the symbols, and the significance of the orientations remain uncertain. We must learn to hold our interpretations lightly, acknowledging their provisional nature, remaining open to revision as new evidence emerges. This uncertainty is not a failure, but a feature of genuine inquiry. The honest acknowledgement that we do not know everything is the beginning of wisdom, the precondition for learning more. Göbekli Tepe rewards humility more than it rewards confidence. Sight is a reminder that the past is a foreign country where they do things differently, a place we can visit through the evidence left behind, but never fully inhabit. The builders had their own reasons for what they did, reasons that made sense within their own conceptual framework, reasons that we may never fully recover, no matter how carefully we sift the soil and study the stones. Yet, the attempt to understand is itself valuable, even if complete understanding remains out of reach. Each hypothesis tested, each theory proposed and evaluated, each debate conducted in good faith advances our knowledge a little further, narrows the range of possibilities, clarifies what we know and what we do not. The scholars who study Göbekli Tepe are engaged in a collective project that spans generations, building on the work of those who came before, laying foundations for those who will come after. Klaus Schmidt did not solve the mysteries of the site, but he revealed them to the world and began the process of investigation that continues today. Those who follow him will not solve the mysteries either, but they will refine the questions and accumulate the evidence that brings understanding closer. The inexcavated enclosures beneath the hilltop are promises of future discovery, sealed chambers that will one day be opened, questions that will one day receive at least partial answers. The symbols that resist interpretation today may yield their secrets to techniques not yet invented, to comparisons with evidence not yet found. The astronomical alignments that seem suggestive but uncertain may be confirmed or refuted by more precise measurements, by the discovery of similar patterns at related sites. The story of Göbekli Tepe is not finished. It is an ongoing investigation, a mystery still unfolding, a conversation between past and present that will continue for as long as there are people curious enough to ask the questions and patient enough to seek the answers. As sleep settles over you like soft earth covering ancient stones, let the mystery of Göbekli Tepe rest easy in your mind. You do not need to solve it tonight. You do not need to choose between competing theories or evaluate the evidence for astronomical alignments. Let the symbols remain unread, their meanings suspended in the darkness like stars whose light has not yet reached the eye. Let the buried enclosures wait in their long patience, their pillars standing in the silence, their carvings hidden from all sight. The mystery will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and for many years to come. It asks nothing of you but your wonder, and wonder is a gift that costs nothing to give. The tension between knowing and not knowing, between the desire for answers and the acceptance of uncertainty, is one of the deepest tensions in human experience. We want to understand, to make sense of the world and our place in it. But the world is larger than our understanding, deeper than our theories, more mysterious than any explanation we can devise. Göbekli Tepe embodies this truth in stone, a monument to human aspiration that simultaneously humbles human comprehension. The builders reached for something beyond themselves, and in reaching, they created something that still exceeds our grasp 12,000 years later. Let that excess be a comfort rather than a frustration. Let the unknown spaces of Göbekli Tepe represent all the unknown spaces in existence, the territories that remain to be explored, the questions that remain to be asked, the wonders that remain to be discovered. You carry within you the same capacity for wonder that moved those ancient builders, the same hunger for meaning that drove them to carve their visions into enduring stone. That capacity is your inheritance from them, your connection to the deepest currents of human experience. Rest now in that connection, and let the unanswered questions keep their vigil while you sleep. What does Göbekli Tepe tell us about who we are? This question has hovered over our journey through the mystery of the 12,000-year-old temple, implicit in every description of carved pillars and buried enclosures, present in every speculation about purpose and meaning. As we approach the end of this exploration, the question demands direct attention. The monument on the hill near Konli is not merely an archaeological curiosity or a puzzle for specialists to solve. It is a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting something essential about our nature that the long centuries of forgetting could not erase. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were us. Not metaphorically or spiritually, but literally, genetically, biologically. They were Homo sapiens, members of the same species that now numbers into billions and has spread across every continent, even beyond the atmosphere of Earth. The brains that conceived those monuments were structured like yours. The hands that carved those animals were shaped like yours. The eyes that first beheld the completed circles were eyes that could have belonged to your ancestors. For in the tangled web of human descent over 12,000 years, we are all related to everyone who lived so long ago. Looking at Göbekli Tepe, you are looking at the work of your own family, distant beyond imagination, but family nonetheless. What did those ancestors reveal about the family heritage? First, and most obviously, they revealed a capacity for vision and planning that transcends immediate necessity. No one builds a monument like Göbekli Tepe to satisfy hunger or escape predators or shelter from the weather. Such construction serves needs that exist beyond the biological imperatives of survival and reproduction. The builders had imaginations that could conceive of things that did not yet exist, and wills strong enough to bring those imaginings into reality. They could think beyond the present moment, beyond even their own lifetimes, creating something intended to endure after they themselves were gone. This capacity for transcendence, for reaching beyond the immediate and the personal, is one of the defining characteristics of human consciousness. The monument also reveals a capacity for cooperation on scales that challenge our assumptions about early human society. Hundreds, or perhaps thousands of people must have contributed to the construction, coordinating their efforts over years or decades to achieve a common goal. They did this without writing to record their plans, without money to compensate their labor, without police or armies to compel their obedience. Whatever held them together was more subtle than these later inventions, something rooted in shared belief, shared identity, shared commitment to purposes that seemed worth the sacrifice of comfort and ease. The ability to form such bonds, to work together, toward goals that transcend individual interest, is another defining characteristic of our species. It's one that has allowed us to accomplish things no individual could achieve alone. Perhaps most profoundly, Göbekli Tepe reveals the antiquity and depth of the human need for meaning. The builders did not erect these pillars because they had nothing better to do. They were hunter-gatherers living in a demanding environment, people for whom survival required constant effort and attention. Yet they chose to devote enormous resources to construction that served no practical purpose in the narrow sense of that word. They did so because meaning is a practical purpose, because human beings cannot live by bread alone, because the questions of why we exist and what lies beyond death and how we should relate to the powers that govern the universe are not luxuries, but necessities. The temple on the hill was an answer to those questions, or an attempt at an answer, a material expression of beliefs that made existence bearable and perhaps even beautiful. This need for meaning is not a primitive impulse that civilization has outgrown. It burns as brightly today as it burned 12,000 years ago. The forms it takes have changed. The specific beliefs have evolved, but the underlying hunger remains the same. We still gather in sacred spaces, still create monuments to purposes larger than ourselves, still ask the same questions that troubled our ancestors on the hills of Anatolia. The stones of Göbekli Tepe are silent witnesses to the continuity of human aspiration across the vast gulf of time. They remind us that we are not the first to wonder, not the first to seek, not the first to build in hopes that what we make might outlast our brief presence in the world. The ongoing excavations at Göbekli Tepe continue to reveal new aspects of this ancient striving. Each season of digging brings fresh discoveries, new pillars emerging from the earth, new carvings come into light for the first time in millennia. The archaeologists who carry on Klaus Schmidt's work are participants in a tradition of inquiry that stretches back to the earliest human curiosity about the past. They dig not only with trowels and brushes, but with questions, hypotheses, theories that guide their investigation and are in turn revised by what they find. The conversation between present and past that began when Schmidt first climbed the hill in 1994 continues without interruption, growing richer with each new revelation. The site itself has been transformed by its discovery. What was once a lonely mound visited only by shepherds has become a destination for pilgrims of a new kind. Tourists and scholars who come from every corner of the world to see the place that rewrites history. A visitor center welcomes them. Protective structures shelter the excavated enclosures. Its walkways guide their movements through the ancient precinct. These modern additions are themselves a kind of monument, expressions of our own era's relationship to the past, our own way of honoring what our ancestors achieved. The builders of Göbekli Tepe could not have imagined such a tension, could not have conceived of people traveling from distant continents by means of flying machines to stand where they once stood. Yet, perhaps they would have understood the impulse that draws those visitors, the same hunger for connection and meaning that drew pilgrims to the site 12,000 years ago. The stories that remain to be uncovered at Göbekli Tepe are beyond counting. Beneath the surface lie enclosures that have never been seen by modern eyes, pillars whose carvings might transform our understanding. It's artifacts that could answer questions we have not yet learned to ask. The full excavation of the site would take generations, and even then, mysteries would remain, silences that no amount of digging could fill. This incompleteness is not a defect, but a gift, an invitation to continued wonder, a guarantee that Göbekli Tepe will remain a living mystery rather than a closed case. The site gives what it gives and withholds when we must accept both with equal gratitude. As you settle into the final descent toward sleep, let the image of Göbekli Tepe soften into something more than an archaeological site. Let it become a symbol of everything that endures in human experience. The persistent need to create, to worship, to gather in communities of shared purpose. The T-shaped pillars standing in their circles are images of ourselves, faceless figures with arms extended, reaching toward something we cannot quite name. The animals carved on their surfaces are the creatures of our own inner landscape. The foxes and snakes and vultures that populate the depths of the unconscious. The mystery of the buried enclosures is the mystery of everything hidden within us, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be understood. The night that settles over you now is the same night that settled over the builders of Göbekli Tepe all those thousands of years ago. The darkness is the same darkness, the silence, the same silence. The stars that wheel overhead, the same stars, slightly shifted in their positions, but recognizably the same patterns that ancient eyes beheld. You share this night with all the generations that have lived and died since those first monuments were raised, okay? An unbroken chain of nights linking you to the most distant past. Let that thought bring you peace, the recognition that you are not alone in time, that you are held in a continuity of human experience that reaches back beyond memory and forward beyond imagination. The great pillars stand still on the hill near Konlierfa, indifferent to the passage of ours, patient as only stone can be patient. The carved foxes keep their eternal watch, their eyes open in the darkness, their alertness unchanged since the day they were cut from the living rock. The vultures spread their wings in postures of flight or protection, frozen in gestures that will never complete themselves. The snakes coil in readiness to strike, their venom long since dried, their menace transformed into something like beauty by the passage of millennia. All these creatures stand guard over the sleeping earth, sentinels of a faith whose content has been lost, but whose intensity remains palpable in every line and curve. Let them stand guard over you as well. Let the ancient protectors extend their watch to include your sleeping form, your dreaming mind, your heart that beats with the same rhythm that beat in the chests of the builders so long ago. You carry their legacy within you, the same DNA that coiled in their cells, the same structures of consciousness that allowed them to imagine and create. When you dream tonight, you dream with capacities they bequeathed to you, inheriting the gift of inner vision that made Göbekli Tepe possible. Honor that inheritance by dreaming well, by letting your mind wander through landscapes as strange and beautiful as anything carved in stone. The morning will come, as it has always come, as it came to the builders after their nights of rest, as it has come to every generation since. The sun will rise over the hills of Anatolia and over wherever you happen to be, the same sun that has witnessed all of human history from the Ice Age to this very moment. In that light, the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe will await further investigation. The questions will remain to be asked. The conversation between present and past will continue. But for now, in the darkness, let all questions rest. Let the mystery be simply itself, without demand for resolution. Let the ancient temple hold its secrets a little longer while you hold yours, two mysteries coexisting in the gentle night. Sleep now with the knowledge that you are part of something vast and ancient and still unfolding. The story of Göbekli Tepe is your story too, a chapter in the long human journey from caves to cathedrals, from flint tools to flying machines, from the first hesitant marks on stone to the libraries that now preserve the accumulated wisdom of ages. You are the current expression of that journey, the place where the stream of human becoming flows right now, this moment, this breath. The builders of Göbekli Tepe would recognize you as their kin, would see in your eyes the same wonder that shone in theirs, would know that the impulse that moved them to build still moves in you, still seeks expression, still reaches toward something that lies just beyond the horizon of understanding. Rest in that reaching, rest in the sacred incompleteness of human existence. Rest in the trust that meaning persists even when we cannot articulate it, that the monuments we build with our lives matter even if we never know exactly how or why. The stones of Göbekli Tepe have kept their vigil for 12,000 years. They will keep it still as you sleep, as you dream, as you wake to another day of wondering and seeking and creating in your own way. The temple on the hill sends its blessing across the centuries, a gift from those who came before to those who carried the story forward. Let that blessing settle over you like a blanket woven from starlight and ancient stone. Let the long patience of the monument teach you patience with yourself. Let the silence of the buried enclosures teach you the value of what remains unspoken. And let the mystery of Göbekli Tepe remain what it has always been, an invitation to wonder, a call to humility, a reminder that the deepest truths are not those we possess, but those that possess us, drawing us forward into the unknown, where every answer opens onto new questions and the journey never ends.